Good evening. I think that we can start. So, after a quarter, I think it's okay. So, my name is Dimitris Poulios. I'm an architect and urban planner, and also member of Common Space and Participatory Lab that is organizing the conference. In this session, we have a title called Cities of Mediterranean Beyond the Environmental Issues. As you can imagine, it's a very broad title and that we can discuss everything. So, but mostly I think all the participants focus on issues related to history, elements of culture, elements of infrastructure of the city. So I think that it will be a very interesting discussion because we have this issue with the projector that hits in the face. Each one of you are going to present one by one. So before we start, today we have 3 presentations from Konstantina Kalfa, that is assistant professor in the History of Architecture in School of Fine Arts in Athens. We have Fırat Genç, who is also assistant professor of sociology in University of Istanbul. We have also Alexander Valentino, director of Laboratory Architectura Nomad and coordinator of the Cool City project in Napoli. We start with Konstantina. You can present either from here or whatever you want. You can sit here. Όπου θες. Απλώς περνάς από εδώ για μένα, παρουσιάσεις από εδώ. Θες βήμα, θες τέτοιο.
Νομίζω είναι καλύτερα να κάθομαι.
Ωραία, εντάξει.
Αλλά δεν είμαι και σίγουρη για αυτό. Θα δείξει.
Έτσι κι αλλιώς νομίζω. Θα το κάνουμε πώς, από εδώ που θέλουμε.
Συνήθως ένας... από εκεί, αν το κάνετε από εκεί να πάω... Ωραία.
Ωραία, εντάξει.
Ωραία, τότε θα...
Οκ. Έχει και ένα κλίκερ εδώ.
Good afternoon. Να το ανοίξω και το 2. So good afternoon. I'm glad to be here. So in October 1947, the United States sent a team of housing experts to Greece as part of the American Mission for Aid to Greece, which was sent after the Truman Doctrine. And these housing experts dealt with Greek housing reconstruction. Yet this aspect of the aid program remained largely invisible for years and not by accident. It formed a key, highly strategic component of the broader American imperial project, summed up in the idea of self-help. In the doctrine, self-help was described as strengthening the will and the ability of the free nations to safeguard their own freedom, becoming self-supporting and self-respecting democracies. As Truman put it, I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. The rebuilding of Greece's rural villages took place between 1947 and 1951, and that would be my main focus today. even though I promised I would discuss housing aid projects in the broader region of the Eastern Mediterranean, including Egypt, Turkey, and Israel, which is part of my current research program. I will today focus on Greece because it was the first of these experiments and in many respects the most important one. That said, I will still gesture toward the wider context. The Greek case thus will serve as a starting point for a broader discussion of the issues involved. The central argument of my paper is that today's often enthusiastic experiments with participatory design and with cheap sustainable materials, approaches that emphasize their ability to strengthen community identity, self-reliance, and pride often, would benefit greatly from a closer look at the historical use of such methods. Right? Examining this history, especially in the so-called developing world, makes clear that these techniques were not only practical, were not only sustainable, were not only used for self-reliance, etc. They were also deployed strategically because they aligned with the socio-cultural conditions of societies considered underdeveloped and traditional, thereby eliciting more effectively the desired investment of labor and local resources from the population. In other words, the history of these programs can offer valuable lessons about the limits of such approaches in achieving spatial justice within a capitalist system. Instead of large urban projects, the US housing aid program in Greece emphasized small rural houses, the so-called rural nuclei, which you can see here, built with the participation of local inhabitants and later expanded by them. This approach carried strong ideological and geopolitical motives. By encouraging individual effort, productivity, and local responsibility, the United States sought to advance capitalist values and counter communist influence, which was, by the way, strong at the time in Greece. Housing became a symbolic arena in which the US attempted to demonstrate to the world the superiority of Western models of development, freedom, and self-reliance. Characteristically, referring to the Greek housing program, George Speer, who was the American expert who supervised it, noted, if rapid reconstruction could not be effected, it was possible that the communists would win the final victory in the midst of the Greek civil war, that is. And his supervisor, who was the world-renowned housing expert Jacob Crane, once said, if this is the Engels of Marx and Engels, then it seems to me that the USA is doing a great deal through several international housing aid programs towards counteracting Engels. So housing aid was much more to the minds of the Americans than helping local communities to self-shelter through their own efforts, right? The primary building material used in Greek reconstruction was stone. Stone featured prominently in exhibitions, and you can see here the exhibition of the survival of the Greek people, publications, official photographs, etc., showcasing the work of rural communities who guarded it, transported it, and built with it in order to house themselves. A public discourse developed around stone, emphasizing the importance of learning from historical stone-built architecture, and you can see here the covers of the magazine, of the propagandistic magazine of the time, the Battle for Survival, issued by the Ministry of Reconstruction, and you can see how communities are building through stone. The Minister of Reconstruction, Konstantinos Doxiadis, the world-known urban planner and architect, said at the time, "Our people have created not once but twice two perfect architectural styles. Byzantine architecture in particular reached a level of technical perfection, and the great dome of Hagia Sophia was constructed without even a single iron rod, while today's engineer is at a loss in the countryside when he must roof a school and has no iron." Even today, the tradition survives, and there are concerns of the Greek land where local craftsmen need neither timber nor iron to roof a building. This material, you understand, so everyday and common as it was, right, was suddenly presented during the period of Greek reconstruction as something full of potential, even as a source of hope for survival. It promised, first of all, self-sufficiency. It also promised that the country's forests wouldn't be destroyed for timber, and that we wouldn't have to rely on massive imports of materials to rebuild. Stones, bricks, and tiles, Doxiadis pointed out, are found in every corner of our land and can be made very easily, even for free, using just earth, water, and sun, end of quote. The free labor of rural communities would turn this natural abundance into the very foundation for reconstruction. The reality is that the work of reconstruction was very different from traditional rural labor. It was closer to wage labor, but also, unfortunately, to forced labor, like what would soon take place in the exile camps, most notoriously on Makronissos. There, political prisoners, communists in majority, and re-education detainees were made to work under harsh conditions, often in the sun, building military or agricultural infrastructure, and living in extreme deprivation. In fact, the line between productive reconstruction and coercion was very thin, and the same labor that was celebrated in propaganda would also be used as a tool of control and political punishment. The above become evident in the way earth-building materials and construction techniques were put to work in development programs around the world. The first scientific uses, or more accurately, studies that transformed the use of earth from a traditional cultural practice into a technocratic object of investigation were carried out by the US Department of Agriculture after the Great Depression of 1929 and later in the late 1940s by the Commonwealth, by the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. The goal was in both cases, was to standardize methods and reduce reconstruction risks so that rural populations could get loans, housing loans, and thus could get embedded into the formal financial mechanisms. These programs often specifically targeted Native American communities with projects guided by the Office of Indian Affairs and at the US Department of the Interior. Large sums of money were invested in such experiments. Experiments were also carried out during the Greek reconstruction. at least from 1949 onward, different types of soil were studied, and the traditional Greek mixture of earth, straw, and water, which required a long drying period, was replaced with a process that applied pressure to slightly damp, wet soil. The bricks produced resembled traditional ones in shape and size, but were noticeably improved. Far less porous, more weather resistant, much more stronger, and with better adhesion to cement or lime mortars. All of this required standardization of unskilled labor. Nothing could be left to chance or to local know-how and traditional craftsmanship. In Greece, the tests were carried out using metal molds, with small students pounding the mixture into the mold with heavy wooden mallets. And you can see one of these experiments in this picture. In 1951, George Reed, who was the second housing expert who supervised Greek housing reconstruction, observed that further developments suggest that a readily portable hand pressure machine could turn these blocks out at quite a rate. It's not clear whether such a press machine was ever actually used in Greece. However, in 1949, a publication by the Ministry of Reconstruction mentions, alongside stone construction, of course, mentions building with mud and the possibility of mechanized bricks. Also, we know that later, in January 1951, Reed seems to have sent a team of Greek engineers from the Ministry of Reconstruction to conduct field research on various applications using compressed earth, and he also sent them to James Davis, an engineer at the Building Block Machine Company, Inc., who had put a brick-making machine into operation in South Texas. In any case, the history of using the manual press machine in the developing world is extremely revealing, showing just how closely housing aid programs were tied to geopolitical ambitions and capitalist interests. One of the first applications, for instance, took place during the Korean War. In 1953, such a press machine was used in Taiwan, which the Americans called Free China, which was at the time home to the military forces and government of Chinese nationalists. And you can see the press machine here. It's also likely that the same year it was used when the UN supported Israeli settlement in Palestinian territories through the use of stabilized earth. Soon the machine spread widely, and by the mid-1960s, with the support of Nelson Rockefeller, one of the models had been sent to over 50 countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and even Europe. Most of these were geopolitically sensitive regions, such as Ghana at the time and South Vietnam during the War of Vietnam. In Vietnam, the machine was integrated into what the US military called civic action, essentially the use of mainly local military forces on projects that would benefit the local population at all levels. So you understand that the machine was, in fact, a geopolitical tool rather than a tool of community involvement and participatory design, etc. In contrast to the apparent naturalness of building with earth, careful design and supervision were absolutely necessary when implementing aid programs based on earth construction, as Crane already emphasized back in 1950. He said, "Let us take the hypothetical case of a community of several thousand rural families in an underdeveloped tropical area. A program is formulated. The program envisages little three-room houses with stabilized earth floors and walls and roofs of homemade tile laid on homemade rafters. Portable water is piped from a mountain spring to a central fountain in each neighborhood. Simple sanitation improvements are devised. Expert advice, both technical and organizational, is provided by the government. The families in neighborhood groups do almost all the work. The stabilizing agent for the earth, the water pipes and fountains, the simple woodwork are supplied half as a loan equivalent to $100 per family and half as a grant in the same amount." So you understand that this is a very well-planned process guided by the US State Department, and also it involves mortgage loaning. It involves having people embedded into the official financial mechanisms of capitalism. So this is not a bottom-up, enthusiastic initiative taken by the community, but rather a top-down, very well-planned scheme, right? Similarly, a 1959 manual for using a hand-operated brick press in Jamaica emphasized that supervision was essential to ensure work didn't stop due to quote-unquote mental fatigue or quote gradual loss of interest. According to the manual, instructions had to be followed to the letter because any improvisation or initiative by the locals could lead to mistakes with serious consequences for the morale and the entire community. At least one staff member in the program, one housing expert, one member of the housing aid mission, had to take on the exclusive role of motivator. His job was to constantly foster, quote, a spirit of optimism and hope, end of quote. The same goal, fostering hope, was behind the large international exhibition on low-cost housing held in New Delhi in 1954, where houses made of earth, designed by internationally recognized Indian and European architects, were on display. In fact, two of the houses were under construction during the exhibition to show that these building methods were so simple anyone could master them. This theatrical demonstration exemplified what architectural historian Farhan Karim, in his book Of Greater Dignity Than Riches, calls, quote, the architectural modernism of austerity, end of quote. Symbolically, this architecture of austerity aimed to convince people that India could stand on its own even with minimal resources. Practically, it succeeded in activating and multiplying local productive capacities. Ultimately, traditional methods were chosen not only because they were the cheapest, but also because they could fit the socio-cultural context as it existed at the time, effectively mobilizing and incorporating the necessary labor and local resources from the communities themselves. It was a technical approach to a problem that at its core was political and economic, the international division of resources and labor. At the same time that it celebrated the benefits of the capitalist free world, It delayed the participation of working class populations in the products of capitalist production, effectively depoliticizing the issue. So thank you very much.
With a presentation named From Ruins to Enclosures, Making the City After Conflict.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. It's a big chance for me to speak after Konstantina, because I didn't know that it's a big chance, big opportunity. It's a big coincidence that I'm going to talk about reconstruction again today, but from a more sociological perspective and in a totally different context, I guess. Today I want to talk about how cities are remade after conflicts, military armed conflicts. So I focus on how the ways in which post-conflict reconstruction reshaped space, property and political capacities, not only through displacement or destruction, but also through more subtle and generative forms of government. So my case today will be the historic core of Diyarbakır. Maybe you know it, maybe you don't know it. Diyarbakır is the largest Kurdish populated city in the southeast of Turkey. So I'm going to talk about the historic core, Suriçi, literally called Suriçi, the historic core of that city, which has been the epicenter of very harsh and severe, intense armed conflict in 2015 and 2016. So, but my aim today is not to present an empirical presentation. I'm not going to talk about the empirical details because tomorrow afternoon at 1 p.m., my colleagues at a panel on Kurdish cities specifically will be talking about the specific details of this conjuncture. So I'm gonna skip some practical and empirical details, and I'm gonna focus on some more or less theoretical questions, such as what kind of power dynamics, what kind of power is exercised through reconstruction in post-conflict cities, and more broadly, how might we gauge the interplay between the state rationalities and market logics that inform reconstruction in post-conflict cities. So by engaging with these questions, I want to show why enclosure as a concept, rather than displacement alone, for instance, offers a more fruitful analytic for understanding post-conflict cities. And you know, today, as battles, insurgencies, pacification campaigns increasingly unfold in cities, and with such developments, new questions arise about the impacts of post-conflict reconstruction on urbanity and urban experience. So while typically framed uncritically as recovery and restitution, processes of post-conflict reconstruction often serve as vehicles for subtle forms of violence, blurring the line between conflict and non-conflict, or between war and peace. As recent research on war-torn cities such as Beirut, Aleppo, Homs in Syria, or Mosul in Iraq rightly suggests, reconstruction redraws boundaries, reshapes memory, and engenders cities wherein spaces for world-making and self-organization are limited. So, but on the other hand, critical studies often approach post-conflict urbanism with some familiar analytical tools such as destruction, displacement, herbicide, exception, and so on. These are important concepts for sure, but and they capture the violence that tears cities apart and the brute force that empties them of residents. Yet, I believe what they often miss are the productive dimensions of reconstruction. The new spatial norms, legal categories, and aesthetic regimes that emerge precisely because destruction has cleared the ground for them are not being dealt sufficiently within such conceptualizations. In Suriçi, reconstruction did not merely rebuild damaged structures, it has generated a new spatial order. It reorganized relations between residents and the state, and more crucially, I believe, it has dismantled the social infrastructures that I call the commons, that once enabled autonomy and political capacities in Suriçi. So my suggestion today would be that reconstruction in Suriçi, and perhaps more broadly in many post-conflict conflicts, and even in post-disaster contexts, reconstruction operates as a form of enclosure from the very beginning. So, drawing on the geographic literature on the commons enclosure dialectic, I argue that enclosure is a generative governmental process that produces legibility, reconfigures centrality, and dismantles the social and political capacities that once anchor communal life. So, in post-conflict contexts, enclosure illuminates how new spatial, legal and aesthetic orders become possible in the aftermath of destruction. In this sense, enclosure is not only a moment of dispossession or extinction. It is an anticipatory practice of reordering and remaking. So now, with these points in mind, let me provide a very brief background on Diyarbakır and Suriçi. So, Diyarbakır is the heartland of political mobilization and cultural production in Turkey. And since the 1980s, it's always been the largest Kurdish populated city in Turkey, but since the late 1980s especially, it has endured ongoing political and military conflicts between the state and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK. And its walled old city, Suriçi, is, or actually was, historically dense, socially heterogeneous, and politically significant. It has always been the bastion of Kurdish activism in the city, beginning with the 1980s, as the forcibly displaced persons coming from the countryside of the country fled into the walled city, into the historic center of Diyarbakır, starting with the late 1980s. So in the summer of 2015, following the collapse of the very fragile peace process between the Kurdish movement and the Turkish government. Nowadays, it's another phase of peace processes going on in Turkey, but between 2013 and 2015, there was another peace process which came to a halt, unfortunately. With the end of this process, several neighborhoods in Suriçi at the time became the site of intense urban clashes between the state security forces and the young militias affiliated with the Kurdish movement. For 6 months, especially the eastern neighborhoods of Suriçi, which was actually the residential core of the zone. The eastern neighborhoods witnessed the barricaded street fighting, and finally, ultimately, large-scale destruction of the built environment. In fact, it was the total razing of the built environment, including homes, including street patterns, including monumental sites, to the ground. Curfews in the area were imposed for months. Around 25,000 residents who live in this eastern part of Suriçi fled, or actually were forced out by the state. And those were mostly low-income families who had themselves been forcibly displaced once again in the 1990s by the state from their homes in the countryside of the Kurdish territory. So the last event was the second of this forced displacement of the community living in Suriçi. So after the clashes ended in early 2016, large parts of Suriçi remained sealed off behind military barricades for months. The government then initiated a mass expropriation in the area. Around 8,000 parcels in Suriçi have been expropriated by the state, meaning almost all the property rights in this area have been transferred to the state. And following this, and in the meantime, the municipality at local and metropolitan level was seized by a state-appointed trustee, kayyum in Turkish, and reconstruction scheme that I'm going to talk about today began under this very extraordinary administrative regime. Before the clashes, Suriçi was an assemblage of diverse urban commons. I do not mean this romantically. So by commons, I refer to material, concrete material and immaterial infrastructures of cooperation and solidarity, as Abdülmalik Simon, among others, argue, for instance. These infrastructures of cooperation and solidarity organize everyday life, meaning these are shared place-based practices that sustain social reproduction, at least in part, outside market dynamics, market valuation, and formal state structures. So most residents in the area were poor Kurdish migrants displaced in the 1990s, as I mentioned earlier. Deprived of formal resources, they sought refuge in Suriçi back in the time, often moving in with some relatives and members of extended families. At the time, in the 1990s, survival depended on kinship, shared homes, and informal work mostly. There were no mass housing policies or social safety nets. Life unfolded under the shadow of state repression and paramilitary violence, which was so prevalent again in the 1990s. Over time, yet, amid poverty and instability, residents of Suriçi cultivated minute practices and relations that allowed them to cope in everyday life. Across my fieldwork since the early 2010s, I observed these practices repeatedly. For instance, women in shared courtyards cared for children altogether. They baked bread in clay ovens, or men shared job leads in local coffee houses. People ran up informal debts at corner shops, or tapped electricity illegally. And even scavenging, though less common, was vital for the most vulnerable families, such as the Roma families living in Suriçi. In short, material commons included informal housing arrangements, shared courtyards, semi-private passageways, cul-de-sacs, and the dense morphology that fostered proximity. On the other hand, immaterial commons included relations of neighborship and comradeship, collective care, informal labor networks, trust-based credits, child supervision, and tacit knowledges that exceed tribal relations and kinship ties, which were more common in the 1990s. So what I'm trying to say is that through the construction of those commons, material and immaterial, in sociological terms, the primary relationships based on kinship, for instance, were replaced by more secondary relationships based on urban practices and urban identities and urban experiences. So these practices became the foundation of a new kind of community. Memories, routines, and a shared sense of belonging transformed Suriçi from a mere physical space into a place where social life and communal bonds were cultivated beyond blood relations. Through these intertwined relations, residents nurtured both survival and solidarity. Thanks to these interactions, they developed sentiments of affiliation to and through Suriçi. So these commons did not exist as a direct outcome of an ideology or a political program. Contrary to some accounts that attribute the politicization of Suriçi primarily to the institutional reach of the Kurdish movement, I argue that it was the embeddedness of commons that enabled Kurdish political aspirations to take root and resonate locally. Or in other terms, in more simple terms, it was the commons that makes the politics possible, not the other way around. So commons emerged from necessity and from the availability of spatial resources. Narrow streets, irregular parcels, layered temporalities of use and repair. Over time, however, they produced something more, a degree of autonomy in everyday life. And to understand this notion of autonomy, I guess, we need to consider this notion of centrality. And centrality was key here. Suriçi sat at the symbolic and geographic core of Diyarbakır. As Alvaro Sevilla Buitrego argues in a recent article published in Urban Studies, centrality in Lefebvrean terms is not merely a topological condition but a political logic. It is a historically contingent form of collective agency concentrated in and through space. Holding central territories of cities provides subaltern subjects with capacities for world-making and self-organization. In Suriçi, centrality enabled the production of political capacities of the Kurdish poor migrants. And this is the social world that existed on the eve of 2015-2016 clashes and the reconstruction scheme. So let me now move to the reconstruction scheme undertaken by the Turkish state between the years of 2016 and 2022. And let me describe briefly the two dynamics that define it, I believe. One, the selective formalization of property relations, and second, the enactment of a normative aesthetics. So in Suriçi, reconstruction began with a redefinition of property relations in land and housing. The former landscape, as you can see here, these are the pictures from the late 1980s, but it was already similar in the 1990s too, maybe more dense. And the former landscape in Suriçi, and the former landscape of tenure in Suriçi was complex, layered, and often informal. This is an ironic situation because in the post-1950s Turkey, the gecekondu, the informal housing, the informal settlements were mostly built on occupied public land in the outskirts of the big cities. But in the case of Diyarbakır, it was a private land. And all these informal settlements or gecekondus were mostly built on private land, and land owned by persons, real persons. But on that hand, there were many informalities going on in these areas. For instance, many residents lacked full legal documentation. Homes had been subdivided repeatedly and repeatedly. Some parcels had multiple overlapping claims. And even though tenancy was pretty prevalent, especially in the later period, especially in the 2010s, many transactions were verbal or trust-based. In other terms, there was no real functioning, effective real estate market. There was no market at all in Suriçi before the reconstruction scheme to a great extent. And it was something that I hear again and again from the bureaucrats at local and national levels. They were complaining about this absence of functioning real estate market in Suriçi, in the historic core of the city. So in the face of these circumstances, the state's response during the reconstruction scheme was to impose a new cadastral order in Suriçi. Again, as you can see here, this new order was individualized, legible, and fully inscribed within a market-compatible property regime. To do so, parcels were redrawn, titles were reissued, houses that no longer existed were given formal geometric coordinates. Contested or informal claims were often invalidated. Residents who lacked documentation, for instance tenants and informal occupants, were excluded from compensation or resettlement at all. In practice, the messy reality of how people lived was overwritten by an abstracted spatial logic. Of course, this was not a neutral operation. It has privileged certain actors and marginalized others. As reconstructed parcels entered the market, a real estate economy emerged where none had meaningfully existed before, while tenants, long-term informal occupants, and even the rightful homeowners and those with contested claims were excluded from this new order. If following some critical property scholars such as Nicholas Blomley, Brené Bander, or Omar Razas, if we understand following them private property regimes as dialectical processes involving both property making and dispossession, then Suriçi's reconstruction represents a moment of selective formalization, which erased unruly property claims and produced property rights upon which a real estate market could be built. So property making and dispossession was at play simultaneously during this reconstruction scheme. This is my point. So, but this was not simply a case of total dispossession, as many observers or critical commentaries would be arguing. Rather, it marked a transition into a marketized spatial order in which the subjects and parameters of property claims fundamentally changed. So this is enclosure in a straightforward sense. The commons of use-based tenure and mutual accommodation were replaced with individualized, alienable, and exchangeable abstracted property relations. In doing so, the new property regime produced legibility, a precondition for governmentality, as Timothy Mitchell and some others argue in varying contexts. It has rendered Suruçi legible to the state and the market in a way it had never been. So that was the first dynamic that I wanted to mention, and the second dynamic concerns the aesthetic and spatial vision of reconstruction. 4 elements stand out here: securitization, monumentalization, tourism-centered zoning, and instrumental vernacularism. I will point each of them very briefly, and leaving some further details to the Q&A if you like. So the first, and I think the most obvious case, is that Suruçi's new spatial layout, marked by widened roads, open sight lines, and cleared public spaces, facilitates surveillance and anchors the display of state authority. A dense and labyrinthine morphology of the previous Suruçi was reworked into an open and surveillable fabric. Second, select historical landmarks were reconstructed or created to create monumental vistas. These interventions inscribe monumentality into everyday experience through open plazas, sightlines, voids, and vistas. What emerged is a regime of visibility in which heritage is reduced to spectacle and dissociated from its social context. Third, zoning logic of the reconstruction scheme reflects a clear orientation toward tourism. New commercial corridors, hotels, and visitor-oriented amenities were introduced here, and the result is a spatial grammar that prioritizes legibility, spectacle, and visual coherence for the tourist gaze, oriented toward consumption rather than habitation. And lastly, architectural design choices reflect instrumental engagement with what is presented as vernacular. In both the commercial and residential facades, one finds a highly created reference to the so-called authentic. Buildings frequently feature decorative elements, such as arched windows, faux basalt cladding, that gesture toward Diyarbakır's imagined architectural past. So yet, this is a selective authenticity, stripped of its social and political context. So taken together, all these elements constitute a normative aesthetic, a vision of what Suruçi should look like and how it should be experienced. This aesthetic regime renders palatable the violence behind reconstruction. It constructs a visual order in which the new urban reality appears natural and proper and desirable. So this is two enclosure, I believe, the enclosure of sensibilities, memories, and embodied ways of knowing the place. So, to wrap up, what are the consequences of these two dynamics? First, the infrastructures of cooperation that sustained everyday life have been dismantled, of course, without some material commons, such as shared courtyards, adjacent homes, cul-de-sacs. Many forms of mutual care simply no longer work. Second, the immaterial commons have eroded. Social networks have dispersed. Tacit knowledges and everyday routines have been disrupted. Many residents, even though those who could manage to stay in Suruçi after the reconstruction scheme, they describe a sort of affective disorientation they feel, a feeling that space is no longer theirs. Third, the political capacities associated with centrality have been neutralized. The historic center has been reconfigured around tourism and state presence. Suruçi no longer functions as a political center, nor as an infrastructural center of communal life. Ironically, as Suruçi is built as a historic center, its centrality in Lefebvrean sense is tamed. And finally, new types of residents and users have entered the area, while former residents have dispersed across the city or left entirely, and the community that once anchored there, that political, vivid, lively community, has been fragmented. And this is not an unintended byproduct of the process, I guess. It is part of the logic of enclosure from the very beginning, by design of the state, Turkish state. Okay, So if we frame this process as merely displacement, we capture only one part of the story, I guess. People were indeed displaced and homes were destroyed, but displacement does not capture the productivity of reconstruction. On the other hand, enclosure shows us how reconstruction abstracts lived space, creates new regimes of visibility, generates legible parcels, shifts the social composition of the city center, and installs a normative aesthetic. In that sense, enclosure allows us to see reconstruction as a generative governmental process, one that actively produces a new spatial order and urbanities. I think this generativity is crucial. The multiple violence of enclosure lies not only in what it destroys, but also in what it builds in its place. To conclude, the case of Suruçi shows that post-conflict reconstruction is not simply about repairing damaged physical environment or restoring normalcy. It's about remaking the city, its spatial logics, forms of value, infrastructures of solidarity and cooperation, and political capacities. By thinking of reconstruction as enclosure, we can better understand not only the Diyarbakır, I guess, but also the broader dynamics of how cities are governed through crisis today. So how the aftermath of conflicts or natural disasters becomes an opportunity to impose new spatial orders, new aesthetic regimes, and new urbanities. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Fırat. Now, Alexander, it's your presentation. So, Alexander Valentino is going to take the floor now with a presentation in Cool City, Napoli.
Yeah. So should I press something to go?
I think we're ready. You have the clicker.
It's over there on the table.
Sorry.
Thank you. Let's stop. So, just to introduce you the area where I come from and where the project started. My name is Alexander Valentino. I am an architect, and I started to work for my city as an active citizen. Right. The area of Naples is. Do you have also a laser to point here? Anyway, this is the Bay of Naples, and the red button, okay. And this is the Vesuvius, and here is the Phlegraean field. It's a supervolcano that with a couple of explosions, sometimes 30,000, 20,000 years ago, it has shaped also the city of Naples with the ashes that became tufa. So it's a yellow, quite soft stone to be worked, and the city has been built with that material to raise the walls, and with with the wood taken from the hills of Naples. Here there were chestnut wood, right? So the entire city for more than 3,000 years has been built just with the tufa taken from below and with the trees taken from the hills. And here I'm taking, I took these pictures just today. I'm sorry, they are not the best, but my computer broke and I couldn't finish my presentation. So you see the city has been enclosed in that space for 3,000 years. The first colony in Naples, Greek colony, was of the 8th century before Christ in this area here, Partenope. And then in the 6th century before Christ, the city developed in this size and has been kept that size for 2,500 years. Just after the Second World War, it developed all over, you see here, and farther. Although the city had almost 1 million of inhabitants before industrialization, today is shrinking, the municipality of Naples, but the larger metropolitan city is today something like 3.5, 4 million of people. What I can say still here with this picture is that between the Vesuvius and the hills of Naples, the Bay of Naples, the entire Bay of Naples actually, is like a funnel taking the water from the Apennines towards the sea. From the far past, this is like Puteoli on the northern part of the bay, which was a very trendy Roman site during the Roman time. Wealthy families were living around here, and it was the metropolis actually during the Roman time, this area, till the very recent past. Everybody had enjoyed the water of the city of Naples, of the Bay of Naples, in different ways, particularly for the thermal baths that actually became very trendy during the Roman time because of the uses done by the Greeks and by other folks before in the Bay of Naples, because here the water is often warm by natural springs. And in fact, there were the ones who developed this technology of the thermal baths in Rome were coming from this area of Pozzuoli in particular. There were even in Pozzuoli, there was, it's not described in this map because it was a most recent discovery. The thermal baths of Plinius the Older was built on an island here in Pozzuoli and was the most trendy thermal baths of the Roman time. My generation grew up in a city where there is no evidence of water at all. And, but looking at the ancient cartography or the ancient writings, you have lots of hints, lots of examples of water. And even in the names of the streets or stories told by elders, you always listen or see water in Naples. But my generation grew up with, cement everywhere, no nature at all. And so at one point, I decided to look for the water in the city of Naples, and although asking to politicians or to policymakers, the answer was always, but you are a romantic, what are you looking for, there is no water at all, what are you talking about? But as you see, for instance, this is the Royal Palace in Naples. There is a fontaine described, shaping the site and receiving the name from the giant here. This is the Fontana del Gigante, the giant fontaine. And actually this fontaine is, after having played the water inside the fontaine, is also having waterfalls here and shaping the street until the sea. I'm telling you this because it will be then come from the project, the cool city that I want to talk about. But you can see even picture of basins with people, women washing their the clothes. This is right in front of the harbor of Naples, and fontaines everywhere with a beautiful shape. And this was such a beautiful fontaine to be seen even from San Martino here, the cloister. And Karl the Third, King of Naples, Karl the First King of Naples, that then became Karl the Third, King of Spain, took it away when he left the city of Naples to become King of Spain. And this is still a fontaine. This is the city center next to the harbor still. This is the municipality. And I remember this fontaine, which has been also destroyed. This was the entrance to the city in the 17th century. So it was characterized by fontaines in the center and other basins here on the side for the animals. This is something I have always seen in the city, in front of one of the most famous 17th century palaces, and it was it's like a metal barrack. Actually, I found out that it hides one of the most beautiful water banks. I will mention about the water banks in a second, maybe straight away. Water banks at one point in the 18th century became very trendy in Naples and were just a kiosk, but very rich in marble, often described, and very rich, also decorated with lemons or other vegetables. And they were selling the most tasty water of Naples, which is coming from the city center, from Partenope, what I mentioned to you, Partenope, which is, I will tell you in a second. I'm going farther. So what happens is that instead, so I started to look around for the water, and I found lots of water everywhere. The only thing is that they try to, actually they call it, today in Naples, they call it parasite water. And it is water that they try to get rid of, right? So this is what they also try to do here. They just throw cement, trying to stop the groundwater moving. So, and this picture is just to show you that at one point, you know, this is a 17th century building called Poggio Reale, so the royal building, right? My generation grew up understanding that this Poggio Reale, it's either the cemetery, which is called Cimitero di Poggio Reale, or the prison of Poggio Reale. Actually, if you say, I go to Poggio Reale, you think you're going to jail today, or you die. Instead, Poggio Reale was one of the most beautiful buildings in Naples, which used to take the water flowing from above and shaping the building with basins, fontaines, and with other structures like a tower here, which is giving the possibility to water to go to move underneath the street and then come at the same level on the other side, and the history of the water of Naples is going to be destroyed very soon, like this map, because the only 3 historical archives we have in Naples, they are closed, and there is no possibility for anybody to even research about that water. And even, I must tell you also that it happened at one point in 1861 when the water is not being drawn anymore in maps as well, as it was happening before. If you see the maps of the past, you can always see water and spring and rivers and canals, but from 1861 you don't see the water anymore. And not even in the regional plan of the waters, there is no witness of the water in Naples and around Naples, although there are often open-air canals. So because we didn't like to be pointed as romantic, we decided to find an idea that might take the interest of politicians. And because the water of Naples is very cold, it reaches the city at the 14 degree, we decided, we came up with an idea of using the water and the ancient hydraulic infrastructure abandoned from 1861, because the city has been conquered by the north of Italy, and the people from Turin brought also the French, who started to build an aqueduct, and they were looking for customers. Neapolitans didn't like to buy water because they had it for free, because the city has been built actually together with its aqueduct. So digging in the tufa, reaching the springs, and linking the properties with the springs. And all the houses had their wells to take the water, and even in the streets there were wells everywhere, and nobody had to pay for the water until 1861. It took some time until the French built the aqueduct. In 1878, the new aqueduct was opened, but they didn't find customers because Neapolitans didn't want to pay, so they've forbidden the use of the ancient aqueduct, and slowly they gather customers. So the city of Naples is here, and it takes the water, in particular the ancient aqueduct of 3rd, 2nd century before Christ, is built with a tunnel entering the Vesuvius, Mountain Somma, and giving to the city with an underground aqueduct 3 cubic meters per second. And a part of that water, there is an amount of water coming from the Apennines, which is coming here towards the city, and it's another 3 or 4 cubic meters per second of water reaching the sea. Here in this picture there are, this infrastructure has been lost. Let's say that nobody can access anymore. Just probably 1/3 of this infrastructure is known today, and but just in plan, not in a three-dimensional way, and it means that there is lots of work to be done, because the idea of Cool City is to recover this water and the infrastructure to cool down the city above. Urban space, but also private spaces. So because of the lack of green, the city is affected by heat waves and very hot summertime. But I must say also that despite the lack of water of the north of Italy or of Sicily, often it's told in the media about those problems, Naples is not affected by the lack of water. Neither from the water coming down from this area, neither from the water coming from this new aqueduct, which is 150 kilometers from away near Avellino, and which has been built, as I mentioned, in 1870s on the route of the ancient Roman aqueduct, which was bringing really the water not in Naples, which didn't need it, but in Pozzuoli on the northern part. The idea of Cool City is to reconnect these underground situations with the overground. So there is no connection at all today between the little green or the urban factory or the courtyards or the public spaces and this network below. And our idea is to reconnect it again. The infrastructure is there, the wells are often still there, and there is an amount of water. You cannot imagine how much water it causes damages in the city. The entire infrastructure, modern infrastructure, can survive just because of the pumps which are working 24 hours a day. Because if there is a blackout in a couple of hours, metro, underpasses already. Okay.
Sorry for that.
Okay, so I will.
But we have a break later, so I mean.
Okay, so I will. I thought. So there's a couple of pictures describing the entrance to the city. You see there are evidences of the water here and there, and one of the focuses of Cool City is to work at the entrance of the aqueduct in the city of Naples. And we are developing a project with the support of students, of other organizations, universities in different places of the city, and through several devices and having in account the underground infrastructure in the area of Santa Caterina Formiello here, we are developing a project to cool down the surface. Maybe you can play with the video in a second. I wanted to tell you because the problem of our problem is that once we get the interest of politicians about the water, they straight away take the water away from us and sell it. And instead of giving it to the community as we would like. Please, can you show the video? Thank you. So actually, this water in particular is not water to be used for our cooling systems, but is the most famous water used as a the first weeks colonizing the city of Naples, and today it's hidden between big hotels built by the new colonizer of the 19th century, as I mentioned, who then came with a new law where water can be given to private to be sold. Earlier in the law of Neapolitan kingdoms, the water was always a social issue and was not to be sold, and so all the springs and all the water access have been closed and given to private to be sold. And here is the picture of people taking the water in the ancient time. We found the place full of water. It's a cave underneath the street today, and it's characteristic this water. It's sparkling, it's iron rich and sulfuran rich. It's good for many reason, I mean, lack of iron in your blood, and the spring has been sabotaged in 1973 when they managed to close it for the cholera. So because of the amount of good water reaching there, coming there, the folk didn't make it privatized. It was fighting for that water for almost a century. And then finally with the cholera, you know, like COVID, everybody stops fighting. And once the spring got the interest of politicians, which earlier were saying, oh, what are you looking for? This is just salty water. You know, you would not find anything. But as soon as they found the water moving again and we drinking it after having tasted, they straight away came and closed it with a new gate. And today the idea of the municipality is to sell tickets for tourists to let them enter the site. But we are still fighting because we want to talk about this water to be able to talk about all the waters of the city, and this is why we will not leave it to them. Okay, thank you. I didn't use my...
Thank you a lot. Maybe you can all come up for the discussion. Έχουμε μικρόφωνο. Any questions? Okay, Thanos here. Any other one? Okay.
Hello. Hello?
Yes, it's okay.
Is it working? Ah, okay. I have a question about the cool water project that you mentioned. On your website, I could read that you want to connect like the water with the people of Naples. And are there any participatory projects involved in the cool water project? And like so to also maybe like enhance like the cultural aspect or the cultural value of water in the city as like a gathering point, for example, in the city?
Maybe collectively.
Yes. Thank you very much. I was already prepared to do this comment, so I was because I have seen and I know at least the two of you. I know you and I know about your work, and I want to make a comment and maybe you can share your thoughts on this contradictory notion of tradition, history, and all this authenticity notion, because I think that what is common and as a link between your three presentations, which were great and somehow presented different aspects, but they had as a link this the typical Mediterranean framework context of something between modernity and tradition, the idea of reconstruction, but also the links with the past, and all this typical Mediterranean, Greek, Italian, Turkish thing that is coming from, I don't know, from the ancient years as, you know, a blessing, and we are condemned to with this. And I would like somehow to discuss on many times, and I can understand this comment that usually Konstantina makes. Sometimes maybe we are doing it we represent the idea of traditional architecture or traditional techniques or this kind of things, or the traditional participation of the Mediterranean people or whatever. And in many cases, this is not actually something that it was really traditional. It was constructed. It was based on a lot of historical, political, ideological, and many other contexts, and in such a way it might not be even progressive in some cases, or in many cases. And this is something that is typical for the Arab world. I can see that, I mean, I have been in a lot of countries in the Middle East, and the representation of the traditional is something that I'm not sure if it is necessarily progressive or anti-colonial or whatever. It's a weird mixture of colonialism and tradition, which in many cases might be reactionary or conservative. It's similar to the Greek traditional, I don't know, the people, the Greek traditional architecture. We have this representation of how the traditional architecture of the 50s, which is not traditional, it was not progressive. In many cases, it was a construction of the reconstruction phase. On the other hand, I believe that there is also a problem with the ultra-modernist, Western, European kind of progress, even in terms of architecture and construction and building. And I would like your opinion, because in a way this traditional notion that is condemning all our cities, even in Napoli, in its own, what is the tradition of the Neapolitan tradition? Most of the Neapolitan people that I know, they don't like this tradition of Napoli. But on the other hand, there are a lot of things that are still remain as sources of resistance somehow, in terms of how they are using the space, the common space, how the people, how they were using the water as a common resource. And I think that somehow we need to think, at least, or I would like your opinion, how a new reappropriation of what is about history or tradition or community of this kind of regions in the world might not be conservative and nationalist and reactionary, but it could be, I don't know, progressive, even in terms of sustainability and architecture and urban planning, but also in terms of political ideology, etc. Of course, I spoke a lot, sorry, but maybe some thoughts.
Anyone else? Question, comment? Okay, I have one. I think it was very interesting because Fırat and Konstantina talked about a thing that has many similarities in a sense, or this notion of redevelopment after a crisis condition, either in Turkey and Kurdistan or either in post-war Greece. And I wondered if you have time to elaborate a bit more about two issues. For Konstantina, I think that although your work focuses a lot on building construction and redevelopment of rural villages, I think that a thing that was also important in this area is all this debate about and policy about land reclamation in the rural areas. And if you have how you have dealt with it, I mean, it was one of the most important policies in post-war Greece from 50s until the 70s. There's also a debate, let's say, that locals, because I happen to work in some villages in the research project in Thessaly, there's this debate that during this period that was also a period that the democratic condition was not at its best, of course, but also the locals believe that because the dictatorship, for example, had this ruling fist and could decide very easily policies, land reclamation moved very fast, and also things that didn't finish during the 70s finished before 20 years ago, and this was very important to the locals because apart from living in these areas, it was also important how to cultivate land, and I think that this correlation is also important. And Fırat, if you could just, I'm not aware of the condition, I mean in terms of policy in the area that you described, how was local authorities dealt with all this issue of reconstruction? Did they have a say? Or it was everything part of the central Turkish government and they initiated all this project? And for the case of Napoli, which was, I think that, sorry, we didn't have more time to present us all these very interesting diagrams and plans. I want to the issue of reusing historical sources of water is something that in Athens we try to do it by the reuse of the old Hadrian aqueduct network. I'm sure that you have been aware of these projects, that we have been also involved in a multitude of ways. There is also, I think that always this interesting and difficult point of how people see it in different ways. I mean, in terms of politicians and local governments. In a sense, although it could be the cornerstone of a sustainable development of water management, it's not something that is usually is seen in this way. I mean, there's a huge discussion in Athens with water shortages, and particularly in the last months, and policies that could help in this direction using these water routes that were historic are not put as a priority. I assume that the same things happen in Napoli, but also in other cases. How do you work with local authorities or regional authorities? Because I assume that water management is not a local thing also. It has to do with many municipalities. It has to do with the region. So I think that this is very important, and it's also important for all of us that work in similar projects to understand how to navigate local authorities in a smart way in order to have something at least, because it's not something that, although it seems very common sense, it's not in many cases. Thank you a lot.
So thank you for your questions. They were very insightful, all of them. And of course, I will start with Thanos's comment on tradition. Of course, as you know, my answer would be that tradition is indeed a historical construction. And not only in modern times, but in every era. Of course, tradition was redefined and used in any reorganization of society. Its instrumental use was to exclude and include every time different groups of people and different definitions of nationality, etc. So I would say that there are always multiple traditions, and each time there are ways to filter down which traditions are useful for any progression in the society. So, for instance, in the case of the Surici city, the Kurdish traditions were diminished and excluded, etc. So you have this multiplicity, which implies not only in different uses within a certain group, but between different groups of people, whether these are defined by ethnic criteria or other sort of criteria. And of course, you always have this kind of violence, which Fırat also described when you redefine tradition and you incorporate it in any new organization of the society. Now, what I also found common in all three speeches was not only, this conflictual relationship between tradition and modern times, but also the fact that what we see and we get disappointed more and more is that whatever was functioning in traditional economies, or if you wish, pre-capitalist economies, is whether not functioning anymore or incorporated into new capitalist ways of. So it's this real estate violence or this capitalist economy violence that, for instance, in the case of water in Naples, wants to use water in capitalist. In a capitalist understanding of value, etc. So yeah, I do not believe I answered to all your rich and big question, but more or less this was the main points I wanted to make. And regarding the land redistribution, of course, we do have this, and again, it's part of the answer I gave in the previous question, that you have property entitlements. It's a way of incorporating local communities into the capitalist way of organizing everyday life, in fact. And what also Fırat, I think, observed is that it's not exclusion and dispossession, but in sort of giving them, and that's the way power works and power analysis, is giving them things in exchange, so to incorporate them into the system. So, for instance, in Greece and Turkey and other cities of the Mediterranean, this was a common pattern where you would make small owners of land, for instance, to real estate players in the big real estate party that took place after World War II. And so, in a way, this is a way of dispossessing but also incorporating through property titles. So, of course, property is a key way of for small producers, etc., to have them back in the new organization of things. So yes, I'm sorry if it took longer than.
Yeah, I don't see you there. Maybe we yeah. Okay. Please, no worries. Okay, thank you. Yeah, here's yours. Thank you for the questions and comments, and I agree with Konstantina in that we can. This duality between tradition and modernity doesn't work here, obviously. And then we need to find out some other conceptual and political ways to problematize this official rhetorics around such reconstruction processes or around the notion of heritage in general. And yes, you're right. And from the very beginning, in the case of Diyarbakır, the official rhetoric around the reconstruction has been built on this, modernization of what is. Modernization of the tradition, right? On the one hand, you have this historic city, and on the other hand, you have this new amenities flourishing in the historic city. But I think what matters more is to think of this notion of historic city, because any historic city is not given. We somehow, in our minds, in our ideas, we construct them first of all. They become historic city at one hand. Athens is a historic city because we construct it as a matter of heritage in the beginning. And Rome and Napoli and Istanbul and Diyarbakır, they become historic cities. So I think the question here, which makes me more, interested. Taking this heritage process or heritage making as something not given, as something, as a field of where, where broader political issues are at play. So in that sense, heritage making is a field of encounters, right? Encounters of ideas, imaginaries, contesting imaginaries. And I think this is paradoxically what matters in the case of Suriçi, because the destruction of heritage, of the historic city of Suriçi, has become possible at a time when it was becoming a heritage. So this process of heritage making and the unmaking of heritage has been the case in Suriçi in the last 15 years. And on the other hand, I must say that the Kurdish political movement's idea of heritage was also influential in this heritage making, in the end of which the monumentalization has become the opposite of the real, concrete, lived space of its inhabitants. Of course, it's obvious that the government, when was thinking of Suriçi as a place of civilizations, as a place of the first homeland of Islam as a religion in Anatolia, they have this very Islamic imaginary affiliated with this tourism economy, of course. So we have this tourism and very Islamic-centered, Islamist even idea of heritage. But on the other hand, the Kurdish movement, maybe since the mid-1990s, was making Suriçi itself as a historic city where Kurdishness was being built in, with all these references to early 19th century, 20th century Kurdish notables having some homes, sometimes reference to the multicultural, cosmopolitan past of the city in a very instrumental way, all these references to some Kurdishness. This is very typical, right? All sorts of nation building processes do need some references to somehow imagined heritages. So my point here is that this making of heritage within all these contested imaginaries, sometimes Islamist, sometimes Kurdish, I think ultimately has made Suriçi as an abstract space in Lefebvrean terms, where the monumentality has become, super over the very real social time and place of the real inhabitants. And in that sense, maybe to your question, Dimitris, of course, all these inhabitants, all these residents went on to struggle against these circumstances. I know that my presentation today was so state-centric in that sense. I was focusing on what the state did. But what is ironic or maybe unfortunate, I guess, all these households, all these inhabitants had to become once again, had to withdraw themselves to their own households to struggle against all these severe conditions, because they felt that they are so alone in the face of these conditions with the Kurdish movement's institutions, municipal or NGOs or the other sorts of institutions, become so obsolete and redundant in the struggle. So this time of ambivalences and this time of hardship were somehow overcome, if they could, through their own efforts, but with the expense of this loss of belief in the Kurdish cause to a certain extent. Of course, there are still supporters and enthusiastic supporters and activists of the Kurdish movement. They can't leave this idea, of course. But now I feel that there is this distance between the local inhabitants and the political elite of the movement, just because of this kind of perils of the heritage-making process. And all in all, even though we are so, and as critical scholars, as observers, we're so eager to support such causes, right, of the people without state, of the people, struggling against some authoritarian states, obviously we should do, but with some critical distance, I guess, considering the complexities and dilemmas of such political processes and struggles in the past.
So, you know about tradition, Thanos, I am the last Neapolitan. My mother is German from Bavaria. My father comes from a bourgeois family. And in Naples, after the colonization from the north, the bourgeois became, attracted by Europe, by Italians, and the language has not been speaking in my family ever, our Neapolitan language. But I'm attracted by the underdogs, maybe. I've been working with Roma for more than 10 years around Europe. And at one point, living in Rome and looking how the capital is behaving with the south, I became kind of more, it's a Neapolitan, no? And moved back to Naples and tried to work for the city. And it was a time also when the COVID came, sorry to speak about that time, but as many others, I also started to see how around the world we were looking at pictures and how the environment was changing and going back to nature, right? And in Naples we didn't see any change because the city is just filled with cement everywhere, no? And I started to, at that time, to be interested in that water. And I will try to answer, I don't remember the questions, to what you were asking, who we involve. No, we involve, because we are talking about stuff that at the first trial, everybody says, oh, what are you talking about, So we started to involve, first of all the private archives and libraries, because the state one, they are controlled by the state. The public ones, they are closed in Naples. So we couldn't get any information from the state. The state is kind of erasing the Neapolitan culture in all ways, many ways. First of all, the archives, we don't see anything. And with the maps, as I mentioned before. So we try to involve, even the older people, because they still remember the water flowing. People were telling us jumping from a bridge. Where is the bridge? We were looking for the bridge. The bridge is still called a bridge, but you don't see any arches of the bridge. It's filled with buildings. And, or a lake. My grandfather used to hunt around the lake. The lake is drawn. And there are few maps showing the lake, as I mentioned. So we try to involve everybody, like elders or communities, communities. People from Santa Lucia, the area there of the Acropolis, they still remember, and they come in the church, the main church. It's crowded. They are, suggesting a way to reclaim that water and the spring and reopen it. And although new generation don't know about that, the elders also didn't speak so much about, what they've lost. We involve the first main office dealing with the water from the Apennines to the sea. The water is a state issue, but then given to the region Campania to be given in concession. But, for instance, for the water there in Santa Lucia, there is a sign set there in 1731, which says that the water is a present of the king to the folk, and nobody can sell it or close it and whatever. So we have this ancestor, we go to the tradition just because, it's an excuse to reclaim some stuff, it's not something that I really feel. But looking at the past, I see how humans were interacting with the water. which today doesn't happen anymore. No? The water is given to you through pipes, and you just open and have it. You criticize when it's not coming out, but I can tell you some interesting stuff. I have a friend working for IFAD, come si dice, la banca. Insomma, they support lots of projects, and he was in a meeting in some African city or village, and there were the girls complaining, saying, you have built an aqueduct, and now instead of walking to the spring and having fun with my friends and gathering around the spring and chatting and laughing and leaving, now I'm closed at home, working every day, don't seeing my friends. So the water was still, even in the history of the people, of my older people, was a way to gather together, to exchange and to feel and beautiness and comfort and whatever. There were so many important things that we have lost anyway. No? We have lost, and I think through the water that we can redesign a city. We can give more green, and we can also intervene in the question of the heating temperature, which can be lowered even 15 degrees, I guess, in the urban space. 15. Yeah. No, really. There are evidences of, just woods in the city that lowered the temperature of 8-10 degrees. There are lots of examples and research in that, Thanos. But because of the amount of water, cold water we have in Naples, there is more possibility to cool down the city. I'm not sure I've answered all the... See. Okay.
I'm sorry, but what you describe is like, for instance, for the case of the village of Africa, it's not just a sudden disruption or loss of tradition and the movement towards something new that locals don't necessarily love. It's also the privatization of.
Sure.
In this case, water or commons in general. So we should keep this in mind every time. Like we've moved towards an era and a period where everything is privatized, including water and everything common. So this is not just the movement from traditional relations to contemporary anyway. Yeah. It's also the fact that we are left out from our access to, something that was
resources.
Resources, exactly.
Yeah. This is what has pushed me to deal with the waters. It's like
exactly,
the last or the most important resource which. We can fight for.
The harsh reality is that the municipality or the state will accept your propositions only if they get some money out of. This is the harsh reality that we have to face as it is, right? So I believe your project is amazing, and I would really support it. But in what kind of?
But I think we can even about involving again. Sorry, one has gone. But we try to involve even the condominium. Sometimes and a condominium has this. Access to the underground and to the empty today basins, and we are trying even to involve just the people above because they can access to the water and they can use it for refreshing their homes and so seeing how much they can spare.
Also,
this infrastructure, cooling infrastructure will happen to be for free. during the summer. So instead of using the energy, you understand,
Yeah,
to cool
of course,
down,
absolutely.
you will
This could
have
work,
almost zero
Perfect. It's just a
expense.
small comment. I think your work also works as a political statement, like showing the possibilities and what we are allowed to do in real life. So it unpacks the possibilities and showing people what could be done and is not done because of. So I think it's very important.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
So we can
We can
keep talking. Yeah.